Hey everyone, it's the first day of the final week. Woo! I hope that we don't have a presenter for this week, so I hope that um, we're able to start the discussion off well. I feel like this week was particularly difficult to grasp, not so much in like sort of like last week when those undersea networks and the undersea cables were hard to grasp because they're just so grand in scope and yet minimally seen. This week was hard to grasp because it just kind of seems to be a little all over the place. And I think the reading itself addressed that, and it introduced the term. I have a lot of notes. It introduced the term antipodality, and it described it as drifting along a moving and variable line, and of thinking and writing from within that experience. So it reminded me of a few of the things that we've discussed throughout this course. The first thing that it reminded me of was the definition of media archaeology and how it's, we learned from the very first week that it's best, arguably, to look at media archaeology starting from somewhere in the middle, and then from there you can really study all the different avenues of media archaeology from the past, going into the future, studying what's in the present, really appreciating everywhere that we came from and technology as it was then, as well as appreciating it as it is now and how it potentially can be in the future. And, it can be a little bit hard to focus on a single subject when studying things from the middle and, moving from all different directions. It can be a little bit hard to grasp a theme, but at the same time, you can just take in so much information, and it can lead to endless amounts of discussion and endless examples of discussion, like I feel like we've all experienced throughout contributing in this course. And this reading definitely touched upon a lot of different topics. 9/11, the occupation of Wall Street, the there was a sentence that I wrote down because I really loved it. It was then the Americans came and Coca-Colanized, and I loved that so much. It was so cynical and yet so accurate, modernization when it comes to Western culture and whatnot. It touches upon a lot of different things. And from what I understand, the author was Mackenzie Werk, but it was a collective piece in that it had multiple essays by multiple people. So it might have been a sort of curation in terms of reading. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought that's what I took from it. And the title of our reading is telesthesia, which means perception at a distance. So that reminded me of what we touched upon a few weeks ago, in how when you're using technology or using social media or using a certain kind of network or a vector, as this week would describe it, there can be a little bit of a sort of distance there, and that you're behind a screen, or you're behind some kind of interface, or you're interacting with something in order to influence something else, rather than influencing something with your own two hands, per se. So it reminded me of that. And it was interesting because not only does this antipodality that the reading introduced and described itself as, it was very self-descriptive, but it also made me feel the way that the reading described itself, and being, how would you say it? Antipodality, and being antipodalic. I'm not sure how you could phrase it grammatically, but it made me explore all these different avenues of thought. 9/11, it touched upon how that was a weird global media event and that it defied explanation. It was covered by so many different news outlets and edited depending upon the audience. And, you know, it used that example of film that depicted victims evacuating the building from windows, essentially, you know, committing suicide. How some of that footage was edited out for news outlets to show to the public. And, you know, of course, it made me think of where I was during 9/11. You know, I was in third grade. So I was a Lil Michael back then. I didn't really know what was going on, but I do remember, you know, I was still able to grasp the situation and what exactly was happening and what it meant. I remember that day in school, we didn't even really do school normally. We had the news on, we were watching television. I remember waking up that morning and it was gray outside. I've always lived in California, so I wasn't, you know, New York is on the complete other side of the country. But as a kid, I remember looking outside at the sky and thinking that I could see the smoke coming from the towers. Just like, I think that that's sort of symbolic of just how much that affected America. Not just America, you know, it had a huge international influence. As our reading described, you know, I think that the person that was the author of one of the essays is from Australia, and all the way in Australia they were hearing about, you know, the news from 9/11 because they were related to the victims of 9/11 in some way. It affected so many different people internationally, and that was one of the avenues of thought that the reading got me to explore. Another avenue of thought that I explored through antipodality is when the reading described social movements, and it wrote, a social movement can mobilize crowds loosely cemented to it via social media. I probably could have written that better. What that meant was that a social movement can mobilize crowds essentially for the sake of protest through the use of social media or communication, mass communication. An immediate example that I can think of that happened recently. I don't know if you guys heard about this in the news. I'm not sure how widespread it was covered. I know in California it was well covered, but I live in a town called Rocklin, which is near Sacramento, which is the capital of California. And a young man by the name of Stephen Clark was gunned down by two police officers who cornered him in his grandparents' backyard, and he was unarmed. It was nighttime, and he was holding his cell phone in his hands, and these men, the police officers, thought it was a gun, so they immediately opened fire on Stephen Clark and shot at him. I believe it was either 10 or more than 10 times, excessively. It got to the point in which he was crawling on the ground and they were still shooting at him. Stephen Clark was a black man. He was a young black man, and then he was in his grandparents' backyard when this all happened. So it was just sadly, it was another example of police brutality against minorities, against black people. So just another reason why Black Lives Matter is such an important movement. But my point is that all my life I've seen movements from television, from the computer screen, from my phone screen, from social media, from news outlets and things like that. I've never seen a protest such as that in person. You know, I've been to San Francisco Pride, which isn't so much a protest, but a celebration of being different in terms of, you know, homosexuality or whatever difference that you can imagine that is considered a minority. Those are more celebratory in nature. But what I saw in regards to Stephen Clark was very intense. I would say almost scary in nature. You know, seeing that in person. I was in the town of Sacramento when the protests started. People were marching in the streets and walking on top of cars and shouting his name, Stephen Clark. And I saw that in person. And I was in my car and I was, you know, navigating through traffic because roads were closed off and it was nearly impossible to get out of the city of Sacramento because there were just people protesting the death of this unarmed black man. And seeing that in person was just so, it sent a chill down my spine. Like, that is social change, or the call for social change from a social movement that was congregated through social media and congregated through a common purpose for social good and social progression. And this telesthesia, perception at a distance, I believe applies to this in that seeing something like that from a distance makes it interesting to read about, makes it inspiring to read about, but seeing it in person is just such a different thing. I suppose you could say that's moving past telesthesia, moving past the social media and moving past the technology and seeing an actual movement in person. It can be scary, you know, it's demanding of justice. It's people more or less on the front lines demanding change from the people who are in charge. Seeing that from behind a computer screen is one thing, but seeing it in person is just so different. And I'm sorry if that strays a little bit from the topic at hand, but I also feel like the topic at hand is not strictly speaking about one thing. You know, that's what I got from the reading. It was sort of, I think at one point the reading described itself as neither here nor there. And it was loosely related to the topic of the vector and how vectors are different depending upon what you're applying them to. You know, it applied vectors to businesses, it applied vectors to government, and applied vectors to the economy, and applied vectors to social media. It applied vectors to American colonization. There's one silly example that the reading brought up, but I can't remember what it was exactly. It also, you know, it did go into media archaeology a little bit. I remember there was one example from the reading that wrote that walking down the street is a kind of media archaeology in itself. It's a tour of the ruins of architectural media. So the reading also went into things that are relatively outdated. I never would have considered architecture to be a type of media archaeology. And yet when I read that, when I say that out loud, I'm like, well, of course it is. Architecture is its own art form. But it's just one of those things that I sort of take for granted as the average person because architecture surrounds us and it's all around us. I'm in a building right now, you know, and there's interior design that's involved in it. There's, my vocabulary fails me, but designing a home, designing a building, designing architecture is an art form. And it's surprising in that it's not necessarily something that I would think about. You know, I apologize for projecting that onto others, but I don't necessarily think that people would think about architecture in a way that's like in awe You know, I think that the reading also touched upon a specific hotel. I think it was in Australia that looked like a crocodile that was meant to be exotic in nature. But once you capture the exoticness of it and you experience it for the first time, it is no longer exotic. So it defeats the purpose of itself, and it removes the idea, it removes the possibility of things being exotic because it captures it and creates it into a physical form that is long-standing and experienced by many people and charged money for, you know, the privilege of being able to stay within it or to even see it. So yeah, I thought this reading was kind of all over the place, but at the same time, it just, I think that was the point. I mean, of course that was the point. It said that that's what it was. That was the point of it. So it led me to all these different avenues of thought that were interesting, you know? I hope that this can be a really good start to the conversation because, you know, I'm sure that you all have your own, you know, avenues of thought that you went down depending upon your personal experiences or things like that. So I think this will be a really interesting week in that we're not all necessarily talking about one solid concrete thing. So I'm really looking forward to this week, you guys. I'll see you Tuesday. Talk to you tomorrow. I hope everybody's doing okay on their essays. I will say that I haven't started mine. Shame on me. But I'll get started either tonight or tomorrow. Anyways, thanks you guys. I'll talk to you later. Bye.